Oh, okay.
Yes. So Marion just said something about the mega mission, which is on its way to Israel. Yeah. We're very excited to be there.
I think they're already here.
Yes, your job, Noreen. Yeah, the Rabbi Adelson and crew left on Sunday. So your job's when you meet them is to sing my praises and tell them what a great rabbi I am.
I don't know whether the lady that I'm in contact with is a member of the Kehillah or not. Her name is Linda Pazer.
I don't know her.
And the people that I'm in contact with are Don Levine and Sybil Lieberman.
Don't know them. All right, on we go.
Was there a class last week?
There was not. It was Shavuot for us.
Okay, that's what
I meant 2 weeks ago.
It was Yom Sheni. For us, it was Shavuot.
I know. That's why I didn't think there would be a class.
No, there wasn't.
There wasn't. All right, here we go. You guys, you're like squirrels today. Everybody's kind of. Everybody's all over the place, which is fine. But I feel like I don't know if we're making up for lost time, but I feel like since we missed a week, if we're jumping in a spot and you're like not familiar and you feel like, did we do this or did we not do this? The answer is, I don't know, man. I don't remember where we left off exactly either.
We did this one.
Yeah, but it's good. Trust me, we'll
but it's good to do it again.
We'll do it quickly. But very quickly, where we left off, because Olivia wasn't here last time, where we left off is we've been talking about the verses that the rabbis prescribed for us to say in Malchuyot, Zichronot and Shofarot at the mussaf of Rosh Hashanah. So, which is great that the fourth parak of this text gets into the liturgy that we're supposed to say. Remember that the liturgies for high holidays also include a massive number of medieval piyutim, a number of our most familiar things that we sing at high holidays. Some of my favorite stuff like Chamol al Masecha, B'yom Din, Le'orech Din, those are piyutim. These rabbis of the Talmud would have had no awareness that they existed. These are things that, interestingly enough, liturgically, we would assume are like, well, you can't do Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur without singing da 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 B'yom Din, right? The rabbis of the Talmud had no awareness that those things existed. So that's really an interesting thing. They were aware of a whole bunch of other stuff. Like they also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they were not aware of the Hineni prayer that the Chazan pronounces before the mussaf. That's also a later medieval addition. This is not, however, a class in liturgy. Inside baseball, when I was in rabbinical school, our liturgy class was taught by a cantor who just felt that we should be reading through and memorizing this 800-page, 100-year-old book on liturgy and its origins, which was deathly boring. And we would literally read aloud from the book, stop, he would talk, and then go back to reading aloud from the book. It was horrendous. We referred to the class as lethargy. So we are, but where we left off was we're discussing how many verses one must say. And there's two opinions. One is that there should be 3 verses. Potentially that means 3 verses total, 1 from Torah, 1 from Nevi'im, 1 from Ketuvim, or 3 verses from Torah, 3 verses from Nevi'im, 3 verses from Ketuvim. And then they pin that to an idea that there should be 10 verses. But for those of you who are mediocre at math, I will explain to you 3 plus 3 plus 3 does not equal 10. So the rabbis started to kind of get into that. And then the other shot that one of the other rabbis introduces is no. It should be 10 and 10 and 10 verses. So we kind of resolved that last class, but the question going forward will then become, all right, what of it? You know, what are these verses and why do we say them? Olivia, go ahead.
Back in that mission, I was just doing some review. If you can go back up to it. The one about 3 says shalosh twice. What was that about?
Where, here?
Yeah.
Imam ar shalosh, comma, shalosh mikulan yatsa. Yeah, that's what there's just not a comma there, that's all.
And if said 3 free from all.
Free from, I would translate kulan as from each. So it's, to clarify, it's exactly what I was saying before to some degree, which is what you're doing, Olivia, is really great. You're trying to what's called understand it inside. Like, why do the words mean what they mean? So I remember reading this many years ago and understanding that you could probably get away with shalosh, meaning you do one verse in Malchuyot, one verse in Zichronot, one verse in Shofarot. When he says im amar shalosh, comma shalosh mikulan, it doesn't mean that, meaning it's got to be 3 from Malchuyot, 3 from Zichronot, 3 from Shofarot. That's why it's shalosh. Good question. All right, let's go. Elisheva, you're going to do the English because you're the first box in Price is Right. Rabbi Yochanan, does someone else have a question? No? Good? Okay. Yes, on we go. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer, im amar shalosh mikulam yatsa. I bailahu hechi kitani, shalosh mina Torah, shalosh mina neviim, shalosh mina ketuvim. Dehavi tesha, ika b'nehu chada, O Dilma, echad min haTorah, ve'echad min haNeviim, ve'echad min haketuvim, dehavayan lehu shalosh, ve'ika b'nehu tuva.
The Mishnah taught that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, if one recited 3 from each of them, he has fulfilled his obligation. A dilemma was raised before the sages. What is he teaching here? Does Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri mean that one must recite 3 verses from the Torah, 3 from the prophets, and 3 from the writings, which are 9 in total? And if so, the practical difference between the opinions of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the first Tana is only 1 verse. Or perhaps he means that one must recite 1 verse from the Torah, 1 from the prophets, and 1 from the writings, which are 3 altogether. And the practical difference between them is a large number of verses, that is 7.
Right. So we did this last time. The rabbis are doing several fun things. One thing is they're pointing out that the discrepancy between the 2 rabbis is significant. It's a large number, right? But they're trying to clarify, is the discrepancy really about the difference between 9 and 10, or the difference between 3 and 10. And they're trying to just basically rationalize whether 2 rabbis would have disagreed over a number that large, which I think is a notable thing. But don't get stuck on it, because it's not something they're going to resolve internally with dealing with the logic of the math. They're going to move on to trying to figure out based on a verse, which we also mentioned last time. All right, Marianne, you pick up this one. Tashma de Tanya, ein pochtim me'asara Malchuyot, masara Zichronot, masara Shofarot, ve'im amar sheva mikulam yatsa, keneged shiv'a raki'in.
The Gemara clarifies this matter. Come and hear a proof, as it is taught in a Baraita. One does not recite fewer than 10 verses of kingship, or fewer than 10 verses of remembrances, or fewer than 10 verses of shofarot. And if one recited 7 from each of them, he has filled his obligation, as they correspond to the 7 firmaments in heaven.
Great. I'm erasing the mark in the book that tells me this is where we left off. That's the last thing that we read in this class. So the rabbis then go a different way. Instead of saying the number between the 2 is very different, let's focus on another logical idea. They bring a Baraita, which supports one of the original Mishnahs. But remember, the Mishnah has 2 opinions, right? One says 3 and one says 10. So they bring a Baraita that supports the opinion of 10. But remember, a Baraita is from the same era as a Mishnah. So it's not a winning proof. It's just an idea, right? So the question then becomes, maybe, and this is a really interesting Talmudical logical idea, maybe the difference is what we refer to in Talmud as the difference between lahatchila and b'diavad, right? Kind of an ipso facto situation, or a priori, a fortiori type of logic, if you really like the Latin, right? Lahatchila means, right, if I show up at synagogue And I'll give you a good example. If I show up at synagogue and I recite all the blessings in Shachrit, and I don't do Tachanun, because I thought that we didn't do Tachanun today for whatever reason, and we finish the service, and someone says, Rabbi, why didn't you do Tachanun? One might say, I forgot, we should do it now, right? But in general, Tachanun is considered a lesser and less important kind of set of prayers that was added later and doesn't have great, force of need. So b'diavad, like as matter of fact, we didn't do Tachanun, we don't go back and say it. However, lahatchila, you don't skip Tachanun, right? If you do a thing and you don't do it perfectly, there are some times when you're like, I don't have to do that, right? Like I don't need to worry about it. But on the other hand, in advance, you should absolutely, the right way to do it is this way, right? Another example of this, by the way, that I love, because it leads me to a story I haven't told in a really long time, is your sukkah, right? When you're building your sukkah, according to opinions in the Talmud, you're supposed to put up the walls of the sukkah and then put on the roof. However, according to most opinions, if you put the roof on your sukkah, if you put the schach on the sukkah, and then put the walls on afterwards, b'diavad, after the fact, it's okay. Lahatchila, you shouldn't do it that way. All right, so quick story, and then Judy, I see your hand. So save your question or write it down before I forget. When I was in rabbinical school in my first year, we were building a sukkah in my buddy's front lawn, which is where you did things in Pico Robertson. We didn't have backyards, we had garages. So we're building the sukkah, and the fellas are putting up the sukkah, and they put the schach on the roof before they put the walls around. And it's Pico Robertson, so it's a there's a lot of observant Jews in the neighborhood. And an Orthodox Jew walks by, and he stops us, and he says, hey, you guys look like you know what you're doing, and you want to do this the right way. So I just want to tell you, you're supposed to put the walls on the sukkah before you put on the schach, right? And all of us say, oh, thank you very much. We really appreciate that. And my friends are Rabbi Meir Goldstein, Rabbi Aaron Alexander. Rabbi Aaron Alexander is basically the secretary of the CJLS, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. He's a really well-known, he's written multiple tshuvot in the movement. He's a very well-known, very brilliant halachicist. And Aaron was, for fun, reading through the entire Arba Turim, which is the base law code of the entire Jewish world. He also then took on a project a few years later to translate the entire Arba Turim, which he has not completed and will probably take him another 50 years. But that's another matter. He also has 3 boys, so I think he's kind of busy with other stuff. But anyways, point being, Aaron is not one to just take some random frum guy's opinion. Aaron goes back into his apartment with our friends and says, let's look it up. So they look it up, and they open the Shulchan Aruch, and they open the Tur, which is the basis for the Shulchan Aruch, and they find the section about putting up your sukkah. And they find that what the Chassid said was true, right? You should put on the walls, and then you should put on the roof. But in the commentary, in a pericope on the side by a guy named Rabbi Joel Sirkis, whose name is the Beit Chadash, the BaCh, it says, however, if one has put the roof on first and then does the walls, the diavad, like after the fact, it's okay, right? And so that means that according to the BaCh, the rabbi, my friends, these rabbinical students, have their opinion, meaning they do not need to take the roof off, put the walls up, and put the roof back on. They should leave the roof on, then build the walls. So armed with this knowledge of Rabbi Joel Sirkis, they go back out to the sukkah an hour and a half later and begin to finish putting up the walls. They start to put up, they are just about to start putting up the walls when, no joke, true story, another chassid walks by, right? This other chassid walks halfway down the block, slows down, stops, walks back and says, gentlemen, it looks like you want to do this the right way. So I want to let you know that you're supposed to put the walls on your sukkah before you put up the roof. And my friend Aaron says, yes, we found this out too a few hours ago, but then we went back and we looked in the Torah, and the BaCh says that b'diavad, if you put the roof up, then you can put the walls on afterwards and there's no problem. And the chassid just furrows his brow and gets very silent and walks away. And he starts walking down the block, and he gets about halfway down, and he turns around and he looks at my friends and he goes, "Nobody holds by the BaCh." True story. True story.
Rabbi,
yeah.
Let me interrupt you. I got a message from Paula that she and Renee are still having problems getting on.
Oh, that's weird. I wonder why.
Okay, no.
I'm here. I pulled up an old bulletin and clicked into the Zoom.
Okay.
Yeah, you know what? I wound up going on the Beth Shalom site. The daily happenings email we got did not bring us to your site today.
All right. I'll let Kristen know right now before I forget.
But we had coffee together and it was nice.
Oh, good.
Oh, no, but you have to look at the Shabbat Shalom to get on Monday. On Wednesday, you look at daily happenings.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be wrong.
Have been working for us for everything.
Oh, sorry.
You know what, I have I put the link on. I have a sheet on a page on my Word where I put all these passwords and links, and I just go there and click and paste and copy.
I just told Kristen that it's wrong there. Hopefully she'll fix it. If she doesn't, I don't have access to daily happenings, but hopefully she'll fix it. Okay, so many people raise their hands. Anyhow, my long-winded story is the point of saying lahatchila b'diavad. So the question is, if the Shaliach Tzibor just says 3 verses from Malchuyot, from Zichronot and Shofarot, b'diavad, they're probably okay. Lahatchila, it seems like they probably should do 10. Okay, Judy, you had a question like 7 hours ago, and then Olivia.
That was a fascinating story. So my only question, which is that the whole explanation that you gave, they don't feel is necessary. In other words, you're supposed to do 10 from kingship, 10 from each of the 3. But if you finish the service and you haven't done 10, you've only done 7, that's okay too. So that sentence, they don't even feel they need to put in. No one has put that in. That explanation that it's clarified, it's taught in a Braita, but if you don't do that, and you only do the latter part, you still fulfilled. And that is what's so interesting is they don't even feel it's necessary to put that little explanation in. Am I making sense?
I think so. I mean, basically what they think
understands that missing piece, anyone who would be reading this, according to them, would know what it's a given, in other words. I said that 3 times. It's a given, and you don't have to put it in.
Got it.
Okay.
Wait, back to Paula. What is daily happenings?
It's in the bulletin.
Weekly
bulletin.
Happenings.
Weekly.
No. The weekly happenings.
Weekly happenings.
We get that on Tuesday.
Got it.
Yes.
So it's not as a bulletin, it's the email.
Yeah,
right.
Email on the weekly happenings.
All right, I just corrected it with Kristen.
Shalom on Friday.
Yeah,
or whatever.
I just corrected it with Kristen. Yeah, the interesting thing about this Braita, Judy, is that it's the most, and we said this last time, the most important difference about it is that it adds this element about 7, right? So that's a good thing to note. But it lowers the standard. The weird thing about lowering the standard, of course, is that like it's not a huge difference, right? Like it means that if you're running behind and the sisterhood is saying, Rabbi, the lox is going to get warm if you don't hurry up with the end of mussaf, you could cut 3 blessings off the end of Malchuyot, 3 off the end of Zichronot, 3 off the end of Shofarot, right? And have fulfilled your obligation. Now, the whole long-winded explanation that I gave of lachatchila and b'diavad, the reason I use that terminology is because of this phrase, ve'im amar sheva mikulan yatsa, right? Like, what is the minimum at which you have fulfilled your obligation before you're allowed to move on and do the next thing. So that's a thing generally throughout Jewish law of like, what's the least that I can do? The conservative movement, because prayer has become so overloaded by generations and centuries of words being added to it, conservative Judaism has done a little bit of hack and slash. And a lot of the time, this kind of phrase, im amar sheva mikulam yatsa, is really important to conservative rabbis because they want to know, what can I get away with cutting from this service? In the Reform movement, they don't care. They just cut things. And sometimes they cut things because it's theologically not appropriate. And sometimes they cut things because it's too long. And I actually really like that. Now, I grew up Reform. In Orthodoxy, not only do they almost never cut things, but they're still in the process of adding things. Go to a Chabad service, and at the end of Aleinu, they'll sing this thing called Al Tira Mipachad Piha, which I have no idea where it comes from or why they do it. And all I ever think to myself is, thanks for making services longer. The other one that comes up in Orthodoxy all the time, if you go to an Orthodox service, is right after they've done a Adon Olam and you're super amped to get out there and go to the Kiddush, some little 8-year-old walks to the front of the bima and starts to sing something called Shir HaKavod, right? Yeah, I personally do not like this because it keeps me from getting my cup of coffee another 3 minutes. But that's just me, right? And also, I am a conservative rabbi, right? I go where I prefer the length and style of service. So I vote with my feet. All right, Olivia, you're up. I'm sorry to keep you waiting.
Oh, I got all the patience in the 7 heavens, which is what I've come here to talk to you about. First, I want to point out before I get to it is that 7 is the distance between the 3 and the 10 that we've laid out.
Yeah.
Which is nice that they're
right.
Like, what is the distance between 3 and 10? Well, it's 7, which is the number of heavens that there are, which like, wowie. And also that this reminds me a lot of when they're talking in Megillah about where you can start the Megillah and still be like satisfying your obligation to read the Megillah. But I wanted to direct everyone's attention to the link that I put from Chagiga 12b in the chat, where Reish Lakesh lays out what the 7 firmaments are, because they're really fascinating read. It comes from this section in Chagiga that's like, you shouldn't teach about or ask about what comes before or after the world or what's above or below the world. And if you do, it's better that you never have been born. And then proceeds to tell you everything about what happened before and after and above.
Nice. Yeah. So one of the things that's weird about this phrase, and we mentioned this last time, and now we've gotten halfway into class and covered no new ground, but oh well, is that I just looked it up. The 7 rakim, appears in the Talmud 9 times, and it never appears in the Torah. And so it's this interesting thing where the rabbis pull a thing and they say, oh, it's based on this. And the thing they base it on is, I would say, kind of fanciful. And the interesting thing you said, Olivia, which I really like, is to bring up that this also appears in Chagiga, and it's way more explicated in Chagiga, which would imply very strongly that this idea originates in Chagiga and is imported to here. But we won't know. We never know, because we'll never know. The editing of the Talmud is so complicated. We never know what's forward and backward, which is kind of like, if for us, there will be statements in America by, Thomas Jefferson and statements by Justice Scalia. But if they don't put their names to the line, we'll never know which one said which, and which one was more authoritative and which one was less authoritative. Okay. Anyways, let's cover new ground. This will be exciting.
I did want to say one more thing.
Yeah.
Which was that they're lining it up. I love that they're connecting 7 to the firmaments, because there's so many other things you connect 7 to. Yeah. But this one is so mystical. And you can imagine each verse that you're saying, like lifting you up spiritually.
Nice.
To these different levels. Sort of like a Tu B'Shvat Seder, where you are mixing your wines and like going through the levels of reality. Because if you're just looking at it of approach of like, what's the least I can say so I can get out of here the quickest, even if you end up with one verse from each, you should think like, oh, one verse, each one verse symbolizing the oneness of God or something.
Nice. I want to add the thought that I had for this morning before I started, which was that the interesting thing for me is that the rabbis give primacy to all three of the major sections of the Tanakh in a way that they don't necessarily need to. I mean, I think there's a perfect logic. It would be perfectly logical to say you need 10 verses from the Torah, right? And to say Nevi'im and Ketuvim, feh. Like, who's going to, why are those important? They give equal weight to Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, which is a really interesting move. I think your point about the seven heavens is really nice also, about like this, it's very Hasidic of you, that we're trying to elevate and kind of go up spiritually. I like that a lot. All right, Rav Judy, you're going to read for us in the English. This is section, is that 23? 23. I'll do the Hebrew. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omar, hapochet lo yivchot mishava, ve'im amar shalosh mikulan yatsa, keneged Torah nevi'im v'ketuvim, amar la, keneged kohanim levi'im v'yisraelim, amar Rav Huna, amar Shmuel, halacha k'Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Unmute.
Sorry.
All good.
Yochanan ben Nuri said, one who recites fewer than the requisite 10 should not recite fewer than 7. But if he recited 3 from each of them, he has fulfilled his obligation, as they correspond to the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And some say they correspond to the priests, the Levites, and the Israelites. This indicates that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri means a total of 3 verses for each blessing. Rav Huna said that Shmuel said the halacha is in the accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri.
Okay, so at the end, this is a very nice piece because it's very clean and has a nice logic to it, right? At the beginning, the argument was, do we say 10 or do we say 3? And eventually they say, actually the argument is whether we say 10 or we say 7. And then they say, actually the argument is whether you say 10, but you could say 7, or whether you say 7, but you could say 3. And what we wind up with is the two divergent opinions are 10 ideally, 7 if you need to, or 7 ideally, 3 in a pinch, right? And what we end up with is the final line, the bottom line, and probably halachically what we would say would normally be the thing that gives force of law is the Amoraim, Rabbi Rav Huna and Shmuel say, we hold like Yochanan ben Nuri, meaning we should do 7. And in a pinch, we should do 3 when the sisterhood says the brisket's getting cold, Rabbi, right? But the funny thing is, as you probably all know, halacha says we do 10, and that's it. But what it then comes out eventually as saying, and I don't remember if I read this last time, but I'll just do it for you anyways. And this is, I think, from Shulchan Aruch, right, our central law code. B'kol achad mevarchim ela omrim lachatchila asara psukim, right? From the beginning, you do 10 verses. Ve'ein pochtin mishalosh shlosha shehalacha k'Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. But the minimum, so you have to do 10, but the minimum is 3, right? Never do less than 3. Shalosh mehem min Torah, shlosha min nevi'im, ushlosha meketuvim. Ubeneinu nahagu lomar et kol haposkim kachova, right? You should do 3 from Torah, 3 from Nevi'im, 3 from Ketuvim. They don't clarify where that 10th one would come from. And, the difference between them is that it is customary to say all of these verses as if they were an obligation. So the obligation is really just to say 3, but the custom is to pretend like the obligation is all 10. This is a very odd way for the Shulchan Aruch to say, yeah, I know the halacha ends by saying that 7 is the minimum and 3 is the minimum of the minimum, but really the obligation is to do 10. So do we have any clarity about this at the end of the day? Not really, but it's a fun argument anyways. All right, onward. And we're getting to a new page of Talmud. So Renee, you're up. We're going to do this Mishnah. It's a short Mishnah. Matnitin, our Mishnah. Ein mazkirin zichron malchut v'shofar shel puranot. Matchil b'Torah umeshalin b'nevi'im. Rabbi Yossi Omer im hishlim b'Torah yatsa.
Mishnah. One does not mention verses of remembrance, kingship, and shofar that have a theme of punishment. When reciting the 10 verses, one begins with verses from the Torah and concludes with verses from the prophets. Rabbi Yossi says, if he concluded with a verse from the Torah, he has fulfilled his obligation.
Okay, very interesting. So 2 things we've picked up from here, at least. One, and this is a reminder, we mentioned this 2 weeks ago, I think. The rabbis don't clarify and don't tell us what verses we're supposed to say in Malchuyot, Zichronot, Shofarot, or at least they haven't yet. Perhaps they will later. I don't recall. It's been a while. But, as Ram Dass taught us, be here now. At the moment that we're at in the Talmud, what we know is that you can select verses from the Torah to recite during the mussaf. But when you select them, you may not pick themes from the Torah that are of disasters, right, or of punishment, right? So, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum, V'chanum, Erech Apayim, Rav Chesed V'emet, God, slow to anger, abundant in mercy, and forgiving to the 3rd and 4th, to the 10th generation, right? But there's another line in there that also says, God will punish to the 3rd and to the 4th generation, right? That would be a verse of puranot. To recite all the verses in Job, where Job is given a horrendous skin affliction, his wife dies, and he loses all his flocks and his cattle and becomes poor, that would not be a thing that the Talmud here would want us to recite. So there's also long sections in Ezekiel and Isaiah and Amos and Micah that are talking about the downfall of the Jewish people. There's the sections of curses that appears at the end of Devarim, and there were curses in the Parsha from 2 weeks ago. So like those things where we invoke the nasty, nasty badness, the Talmud is basically saying like, yeah, I know today is the day of judgment, but like, don't be that judgy, man. Don't get so negative and awful that you're going to bring in the scary, scary Torah. Bring in the nice, nice Torah. And then it continues by adding the order, and the order is interesting. It says you should begin with Torah and conclude with Nevi'im, which is interesting because it implies that we go slightly out of order, what we would have logically done. Basic logic would say you do 3 verses from Torah, 3 verses from Nevi'im, 3 verses or 4 verses from Ketuvim. This line in the Mishnah implies that we do 3 of Torah, 3 or 4 of Ketuvim, and we conclude with Nevi'im. Why? Hopefully our rabbis of the Gemara will explain it. All right. Interesting. Olivia, go ahead.
Jasper is giving me for puranot like retribution or even like reward as that kind of color of punishment, which we might expect you would focus the verses around because the high holidays are a time of repentance, and you would want to remind people of the consequences of misdoings.
Right.
And they're saying specifically, don't remind us.
That's right. Yeah. I think that's a nice theological idea, which is it's really, this is a very serious day, but like Judaism isn't meant to be the sort of Damocles hanging over your head, right? Doom and gloom, the fires of hell. This is not our theology. You should.
We're already thinking about it. We don't have to rub salt in the wound.
Right. So that's a very, right. So, and I mentioned this before, and I definitely say this to my congregation most years, which is that there's a disagreement between Sephardim and Ashkenazim about how to treat Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. In the Ashkenazi world, Rosh Hashanah is the birthday of the world, and it's kind of celebratory, and it's a very laid-back holiday. And Yom Kippur is a scary, scary day of judgment. And in the Sephardic world, it's the opposite. Rosh Hashanah is the day in which, theologically, we are judged. It is called Yom Din. And Yom Kippur is the day when God forgives all our sins, and therefore it is a day of joy, right? It's very interesting to have two different traditions that have a different emotional connection to the liturgy and to the ideas and the theology of the holiday. And I think it's reflected here, Olivia, by this idea about the puranot. I always think of puranot as disasters because I think that that's a translation in one of our prayer books. So onward, let's keep going. Paula, you're up. You're going to read this where it says Gemara, and I will do the looks like Hebrew to me. Gemara. Malchuyot kigon chai ani naum Adonai Elohim im lo biyad chazaka ubezroa netuya ubechema shefucha emloch alechem va'af al gav de amar Rav Nachman kol ki hai ritcha lirtach kudsha brichu alan ve'lifru kinan kevan de baritcha amar ad kuri ritcha beresh shata la madkarinan. Go ahead.
The Gemara cites examples of verses that may not be used in Rosh Hashanah prayers because they deal with punishment. With regard to the verses of kingship, for example, as I live, says the Lord God, surely with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm and with fury poured out, I be king over you, Ezekiel. And although Rav Nachman said about this verse, with regard to any anger like this, let the Holy One, blessed be he, express that anger upon us and let him redeem us. That is the process necessary for redemption. Since the verse was said with anger, it is not included as one does not mention anger on Rosh Hashanah.
Great. So the rabbis are doing theology now, and they're doing, so one of the interesting things about, and this is a great little side piece. Some of you have probably heard the name Solomon Schechter. If you know it as maybe the name of an organization of day schools. CDS apparently used to be a Solomon Schechter school once upon a time. Additionally, if you know a little bit about him, he was the rabbi who went to Cairo and discovered a Geniza full of discarded shemot, little letters in Hebrew, which became one of the most important archaeological finds in Jewish history. We literally find letters that Maimonides wrote to other people in his own handwriting in the Cairo Geniza, which is super cool. But one of Solomon Schechter's most important works is a book called Aspects of Rabbinic Theology, which I recommend. It's a hard book to read, but not that hard. It's actually pretty straightforward for a big-time intellectual theological work. And Aspects of Rabbinic Theology is Solomon Schechter pulling lines like this out of the Talmud to figure out what exactly it is that the theology of the rabbis was. Because the rabbis were not aware that they were doing theology. The Talmud is not a theological book, lahatchila, intentionally. It's a book about everything, right? And the rabbis talk about everything. And the word theology did not exist 2,000 years ago. These guys didn't know that they were contemplating how God works in the world, right? But this question right here, this paragraph that we have just done, is one of the most important theological paragraphs that you will ever come across in the Talmud, because it asks, what is God thinking and feeling? And how are we able to move or not move God when we pray to God, right? We have effed up all year long and we feel really bad about it, right? what do I say in my prayers to invoke God's blessing? And Rav Nachman here strongly says, right, any anger like this, the Holy One, blessed be, let God express the anger upon us and let God redeem us, right? This is a weird theological statement that one could take serious issue with, I think, which is, it's a little bit about you. There's two ways to read it, I think. One is to say, sometimes people need to vent, right? And when someone needs to vent, you don't give them advice, you just listen. When someone is pissed off, you let them get it out and then you move on, right? The implication here is that when God is really pissed off at us at Rosh Hashanah, we should let God vent. And Rav Nachman is implying very strongly that reciting, as I live, says the Lord God, surely with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm and fury poured out, will I be king over you? That's a thing we should let God say, because God is pissed off and God should bring it. Now, the opposite argument that the Talmud is basically bringing as a rejection, which is, since the verse is said with anger, one does not mention anger on Rosh Hashanah, is to say, let us not make the divine, the Holy One, blessed be, into an abusive spouse, right? If God is one spouse and Israel is the other spouse, we should not get wrapped into an abusive relationship where yelling at your spouse in anger is countenanced and permitted, even when we have sinned, even on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, right? And by the way, the pshat, the dominant voice in the text is basically the Mishnah, which is to say, we don't say this kind of thing, right? We don't invoke lines that mention God's anger. This is also a great kind of paragraph. If anybody ever says, if you ever hear the phrase, the Old Testament God of wrath to you, right? Judaism didn't stop developing as a religion at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And the Judaism we practice today is this Judaism, which means we don't believe in the wrathful, angry God who throws thunderbolts down from heaven. That's Zeus, right? We believe in Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, and our God is a God who has literally been commanded in the Mishnah. Interesting, the Mishnah. The rabbis have decided that God is not allowed, we are not allowed to mention God's punishing aspect, which very strongly implies that when we recite verses, we're telling God what to do with us, right? It's a very deep theological thing of psychoeffectiveness and maybe teleological, that's not the word that I wanted to use. I forget the word, but it's here. I wrote it down somewhere. That we're trying to affect God. We're trying to make sure that God is being moved by us in a way that that we can invoke it. All right, Marion, you had your hand up, and then Olivia.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to say that one can express his anger, and God can express his anger without sending down thunderbolts and all that kind of thing, and then forgive us and then redeem us. It can be the same in the same package, so to speak. And it happens time after time in the Torah, as a matter of fact.
Yep. Agree. Olivia, you're up.
I always saw moments like this, like how Moses tried to calm down God by appealing to God's different natures. And the rabbis just want to remind God of the right things. But I like this step that you're taking beyond just reminding God of the aspects of God that we want God to be doing, to when we say those aspects of God, that's kind of the God that we're creating.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really cool theology. Thank you for taking it that step.
Yeah. I mean, I could be over reading the text, but I don't think I am. I almost think this is pshat, right? That we are, the rabbis believe they are creating the boundaries under which God must operate, right? This is very parallel to a very famous little piece in Talmud that I've studied before, in which God, the rabbis are debating what is the blessing of the high priest when the high priest goes in on Yom Kippur to say one blessing before the Holy One Blessed Be. And the Kohen Gadol goes in on Yom Kippur, the highest day, and pronounces the blessing. And one of the blessings recorded in the Talmud that the Kohen Gadol would say is, may God restrain God's anger before God's people, and never to some yada, yada, yada. I don't remember the rest of it. Now I want to find it. But it's basically like the high priest kind of shackles God and says, like, yeah, I'm gonna beseech you to kind of like bind you and hold you back. And that's because we formulate the boundaries by which the divine operates. Now, maybe that's actually not really true. Maybe we're just hopefully asking God to do this. But I think I agree with Olivia 100%. I would say we're kind of creating the God that we want to operate on us. Renee, go ahead.
It sort of reminds me of if we are created in the image of God, then we also have anger and then we forgive. It's not a one-way street at all times.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I often think about God's emotions and what that ought to mean for us and how we might understand it, especially when we struggle with the idea that God is angry and wrathful, that God is sorrowful and sad, right? What do we do with that? That this is like basically my whole rabbinate because of Chassidut the last 5 years, which is, I feel like I was trained many of us were trained as conservative rabbis to be very intellectual and very philosophical and very moral and very obligational, but not very emotional. And as I've gotten older, I've become more and more emotional. But two of my great rabbis, Rabbi Brad Artson and Reb Mimi Feigelson, were all about accessing the emotion in the religion. And so that's kind of what I do the whole time. I'm the rabbi who cried 3 times yesterday, right? That's my jam. By the way, I don't blubber because you're just really not allowed to. You just absolutely, if you can't get through an El Malay Rachamim without bursting into tears, you're in big trouble. So what are you going to say, Renee?
I also want to add that you did a beautiful job in giving that award to the woman that was honored yesterday.
Lidush.
Yes, you did a beautiful job.
Yeah, so I did that, and I did a funeral, and the funeral was someone I'd never met who hadn't been at BaCh Shalom in years, and those are harder because when you don't know somebody, it's harder to figure out what exactly. Because one of the challenges that I had in rabbinical school was that I was taught to drash the person, and so when you get very little information about the person, it becomes much, much, much more difficult. I know other rabbis who went to another rabbinical school who they were not taught that way. They were taught that at a funeral, at a wedding, at whatever, you reach into the parsha and you say some brilliant piece of Torah that everyone can be enlightened by that may or may not have anything to do with the couple, right? That's an old model that mostly isn't used anymore. Even JTS has moved away from the impersonal Torah. But yeah, it's nice. It's easy to say nice things about wonderful people. And everyone at BaCh Shalom is a wonderful person. I assume everyone at Kilat HaKerem is also wonderful, but I can't prove that. So the 3 people who come to this class every week are wonderful. So, all right, let's keep going. I think, Renee, did you read already?
That's called schmooze.
You read already. All right, Olivia, you're up. You're going to do line 2. Zikaron Kigon, Vayizkor ki basar hema v'gomre, Shofar Kigon tiku shofar begiva v'gomre.
Similarly, verses of remembrance that speak of a punishment may not be used in Rosh Hashanah prayers. For example, so he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes by and does not come again. From Psalms 78. nor verses of shofar, which refer to calamity. For example, sound the shofar in Giva, and the trumpet in Ramah. Sound the alarm in Beit Aven behind you, O Benjamin.
Good.
I know Hosea well enough to know what's going on there.
Yeah, I'll explain that briefly. It's so Hosea is speaking of what happens when the people sin. And one of the theologies that recurs in Isaiah, in Micah, in Hosea, and Amos, which are some of my favorite books, is this basic principle that national sin brings national disaster. And national disaster, the way the rabbis generally understood it in that era, was all the countries around them invading, right? Wars in ancient Israel were not caused by geopolitical forces. They were caused by our sinning, specifically in the prophetic period, towards the poor and the orphan and the widow and the stranger. And when we sinned towards those people, then the nations nearby would invade us and whoop our butts, right? They were the righteous fist of God's anger towards our own iniquity. So this verse here, sound the shofar in Giva and the trumpet in Ramah, is about sounding the shofar as we have to come to defense of ourselves in war, right? And it's a bit of a scary verse. The other verse is a kind of Psalm 78 is a pretty light one, right? It doesn't feel that bad. It doesn't feel very horrible, but it's pretty, it's basically like, you know, it still says that like the mussaf Amidah on Rosh Hashanah should close with nice verses, right? Like it should close with Tiku b'chodesh hashofar keseh b'yom chagenu, right? Like sound the shofar at the new month. It should be nice and bright and light, and it shouldn't be scary, even a little bit, which is pretty interesting. Go ahead, Elisheva.
It immediately reminded me of your Haftarot, that the last verse is negative, and whenever that occurs, we repeat an earlier positive verse after it. So it should always end on a high note. Right.
That's another nice way of looking at it. By the way, I just got a message from Kristen that she fixed the link. So I don't know if you could ever get better service on demand than, right? Like we didn't even finish the class and Kristen fixed it. So
Thank you.
So if anybody wonders, what does Kristen do all day? The answer is everything. Everything that Dee doesn't do anyways. All right. Let's keep going. We'll do one more section and we'll call it a day.
Everything that Audrey doesn't do.
And everything
I had a quick question. That Psalms, the context of that Psalms is so confusing. Can you click on it so we can all see?
Sure.
So if you click on that Psalms, it'll bring it up on the right, which literally is about how God didn't inflict wrath, right? 38 is like, but God, being merciful, forgave iniquity and would not destroy. God restrained God's wrath time and again and did not vent to God's fury. For God remembered that they were but flesh, a passing breath that does not return.
All right, I'm going to say it in Hebrew. Wait, I'm going to say it in Hebrew, and the first person who recognizes it, yell out. V'hu rachum yichaper avon v'lo yashchit v'irba l'shiva po la'ir kol chamato. What is that? Paula, you know. Unmute yourself.
I know it by heart, but I don't remember exactly where it is.
That's right.
I'm exactly with you. My retrieval is not working.
Okay. It is the line we say, how about if I sing it like this? V'hu rachum yichaper avon v'lo yashchit v'irba l'shiva po la'ir kol chamato. Arai Hoshia HaMelech Yanenu B'Yom Korenu Baruch Hu Et Adonai Hamvara. It's Mariv. Yeah. It's the first thing we do in Mariv. Which, to your point, Olivia, it's fascinating that the rabbis cut the 39 off from 38, knowing that 38 is a lovely line. Not only is 38 a lovely line that would, in context, make us feel like we're reminding God not to invoke wrath, but it's so lovely that we say it every single night. It's pretty remarkable. By the way, you at Rodef Shalom do not say it every night. That got cut out of the Reform prayer book, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know why.
Because generally the reform, like the
somewhere in Schach
reward and
too.
punishment from Judaism.
Yeah, that's true.
But I guess what my question is what are they seeing in this verse that is about puranot?
I think they're actually kind of jumping off the script from puranot. They say it's puranot is disasters. This is more about punishment. I think this verse, and correct me if I'm wrong, everybody else, it really implies that man is mortal, and the way that they express humans' mortality is in a very flip kind of way. They are but flesh, a passing breath that does not return, right? God could destroy you with the blink of an eye, with the snap of a finger, and it wouldn't be no skin off God's nose. But we should not choose those verses when we are trying to invoke God's mercy on Rosh Hashanah. That's my take. But I think any answer that you would come up with would be at least as good as mine. So, any other thoughts or comments? Awesome. All right, we're going to stop there because we're right on time. I'll stop the, I'll click stop share, and then hopefully it'll let me stop the recording. How do I stop the, I have to close that. Sorry. What a wonderful way to end class, by me mumbling out loud about the things in Zoom that I don't know how to click.